As I say, thank you for inviting me to speak at the for Abicum here. The subject, as has been hinted, is one that's not widely covered, but those of you who do know the subject will undoubtedly find that it skates over a lot of things, and and is a very personal view of the period. And I'm sure that from other perspectives, not least a Welsh perspective, it would look different and sound different, and different points would be made, different emphases would come. But this is very much the view that I've developed over the years of working on Wroxeter and on the wider questions of the post-Roman world, which I've been doing since really I was an undergraduate at Liverpool. So this is very much my perspective on this situation. We obviously have two very clear end points, start points and end points. We start with the Roman Empire, whose boundaries were set really at its maximum extent by Trajan in the early to mid 2nd century AD. There were various changes after him, but that's basically the extent of it. And then, of course, at the other end, we have Offa's Dyke. And in between, we have a territory, an area that is at first ruled by the Romans and then falls out of the Roman world into a new world, the early medieval world. And that transition is really what I'm interested in. Okay, the quote here is from the song Umar Orhid, which I gather is sung at the soccer matches, I became interested in it because it's the only song that I know of that mentions a Roman emperor. In this case, Maxim Vladic, the Magnus Maximus, of whom we'll hear more later on. But I very much enjoyed the point that he makes in the song, which is that the Welsh are still around, despite everything that's been done to them over the years, and that's really one of the themes that I'll be examining in this lecture. There are two sides to a frontier, of course, and people rarely consider the Welsh side. That's usually talked about from the English perspective, and that's what I want to do, is talk about the Welsh perspective. It is worth also pointing out that the Welsh are not mentioned in the Roman period. The tribes that are within what we now call Wales are mentioned, of course, but Wales as a concept doesn't exist in the Roman world. And so that poses the question of, when did Wales become Wales, and why did it become into being? And that's really what this lecture is about. Like the English, the Welsh belong in the early Middle Ages. They are a creation of that period. But they are, unlike the English, the direct descendants of the people who lived in Britain during the Roman period. They are technically Brythonic, British-speaking people. They themselves were always conscious of the difference between themselves and the incoming settlers, the English or the Normans, but clearly never really had the power to resist both of those nations, which of course were became much more powerful than the Welsh could ever be. But they could, however, resist and slow down any conquest. Their difference, how they measured their difference, and everyone else for that matter, from the English, was expressed through three key facets in this early period. First, their language, Brythonic, what we now call Celtic, loosely Welsh. Their Roman identity, which they had adopted, and Christianity. The last of these two are very intertwined, as we'll see, and it's not an accidental adoption, as we'll see. Okay, a brief word about pre-Roman Wales. We know very little of the pre-Roman Welsh, other than what we are told by the Romans, and of course the Romans are a biased source. They are, and the writers that have come down to us that discuss this area may not even have visited Britain, let alone Wales, while expressing opinion about talking about the history of the peoples. So we are told by Ptolemy, the geographer, of the peoples that inhabit what we now call Wales, and the names are given here on the map. Roughly, we don't know the boundaries, and obviously there's a big gap in the middle there, which may or may not have been covered by the Ordovices, or we just don't know if there were tribes who aren't mentioned. We also know that the principal habitation, if you like, for these people's principal known habitation are the hill forts. There may have been other sites, of course, but we just don't know of them or haven't discovered them. But the most obvious ones are the hill forts. I put on one of the lesser known ones as a hill fort, which is Cawes Castle on the Shropshire Welsh border, which is it's famous as a Norman castle, but it's now been recognised that underneath it is an Iron Age hill fort. We have no idea of the relationship of these peoples to these hill forts, or even whether they were occupied up to the period of the Roman world. The Roman occupation of Wales, it is early, relatively. We know of attacks in the 40s, and they continue through until the final conquest, really around about under the first year of Agricola in 78 AD. And quite often, I know Caddy do this, they present the Roman conquest as largely a failure, but I'm afraid this is nonsense. Wales had been fully conquered by the 80s AD, there's no question of that. And proof of that really is that by the 150s AD, the garrisons had largely been removed. You see the number of forts there in the Flavian period in the late 1st century AD, but by the mid 2nd century, 60, 70 years later, the pattern on the right there, which is the 4th century pattern, had already been established. Most of the garrisons were empty. These forts that are shown did have some soldiers, but they will almost certainly have been acting almost like policemen rather than actually campaigning against enemy troops, if you see what I mean. So Rome had pacified Wales in that sense, and it had become part of the wider province of Britannia. And of course, the implication of that is that there is no frontier, or at least the only frontier that there is the sea, because there is no land frontier at all. There's no division between what's happening in what we now call Wales and what we now call the Welsh Marches or the counties of Cheshire, Shropshire, Herefordshire. They were just continuous lands. They may have been under different tribal occupations, but that didn't necessarily mean anything at all. There was there was free movement, if you like, between the two. And they were culturally very similar. The Romans would not have allowed tribes to fight each other. You weren't allowed to carry weapons, for example, other than for hunting. So peace will have reigned between these tribes as far as we can tell. There's certainly no sign of any conflict at all, either between the Romans or between the peoples themselves. So obviously the Roman Empire is not a static entity. We've seen that it grows, but the implication of that also is that it declines and changes and eventually, of course, doesn't exist anymore. So the major point that has an impact on this story comes late in the 3rd century, when the Emperor Diocletian, of whom this may be a portrait, we don't know. We don't know what he looked like. Happened in about 10 years after he came to the throne. We don't actually know when he enacted this reorganisation, and certainly when it won't have been applied in Britain before 296 AD, because Britain was in rebellion when Diocletian came to the throne, and so he had no power to exert in Britain itself until it was conquered by Constantine's father, Constantius. The point about Diocletian is that he took on board the fact that the empire had grown in terms of population, more people to tax, and the old provinces were just too large to administer taxation effectively. He needed more taxes to pay for the army and the civil service, which had expanded enormously. And so what he did was he divided up the larger provinces of the early empire into much smaller ones. He broke them up, and he arranged them under the umbrella of a new tier of government, the prefectures. And so basically Britannia is a prefecture with Gaul, and within Britain there are 4 provinces. There had been 2 under Severus in the early 3rd century, and now there were 4. And of course, the one we're interested in is the blue one, which is the only one of the 4 that stayed effectively in British hands after the Roman period ended. And that's really the story of that is what's going to occupy the beginning part of this lecture. So the province has recreated. We don't know the mechanism and we don't know the boundaries, which is why I've given a very woolly boundary here as a sort of grey ribbon. The boundaries of the provinces almost certainly will have followed tribal boundaries, unlike modern colonialism, where you just draw a straight line across a map and say you have that half and we'll have the other half, as they did in Syria, for example. The Romans tended to take more awareness of the local organisation if they could. If there was none, they imposed one. But if there were something there, they will have used it because it was a lot easier to do so. So the boundaries here I'm suggesting are following roughly the tribal routes, the tribal boundaries that had been established or recognised early in the Roman period. Basically, what we're looking at is the watershed, certainly in the northern part, the watershed between the Trent and the Mersey, which runs roughly along the Shropshire-Staffordshire border, and then we're coming down to include the Cotswolds, and then down through the boundaries, the old county boundaries between Hampshire and Dorset, for example. So Hampshire and Wiltshire excluded, but Somerset, Dorset, Gloucestershire, and Hereford, Worcestershire are included. Warwickshire is sort of in the grey area. We don't know, but likely was mostly excluded. So, as I said, it's just an approximation, but within that territory, there is a very large number of Romanised towns and other settlements, but you'll notice that the weight of those is very much on the eastern side. There is very much a core within that circle, and in fact, you could push that boundary. If you excluded Carmarthen, you'd be moving right up towards Caerwent, and you could virtually draw a straight line between Chester, Caerwent, and Exeter, and that would include the vast majority of the Romanised areas. the heartland, if you like, of this new province. I give you some of the town maps, and in particular the maps of the Civitas capitals and the colony, which is Gloucester. The Civitas capitals are the tribal capitals, and they are likely to be the most important towns in this province. One of the quirks of this proposed boundary is that the vast majority of the natural resources of the Roman province of Britannia are within this one province. It includes the only deposits of gold. It includes the only deposits of tin, and it includes significant deposits of copper and lead. And lead, of course, yielded silver if properly treated. The only iron source that we know of that was exploited in the Roman period and exploited very intensively was the Forest of Dean, and that's why that cross is there. But we know that there's plenty of iron exploited on much smaller scales in, for example, Shropshire. The blue stars are the natural brine springs. So salt was a very important commodity too, and all four of them are located within the province. So we have a very broad range of materials, and of course, it's a very rich agricultural territory as well, particularly in the lowlands on the eastern side there, and on the littoral, the coast of South Wales in particular, where again Romanism was very heavily evidenced. Anglesey, to a degree, also has the same agricultural base. And we can see some of this wealth reflected in the development of places like Caerwent, where we have, early in the 4th century, we have quite major refurbishments and evidence of building. The Forum had been built earlier in the town's history, obviously, but it was completely rebuilt in the late 3rd, early 4th century to stabilize it. It had started to collapse because of a poorly constructed foundation over a drain. So they had to rebuild, and they refitted the basilica, and the town's council chamber seems to have been reorganized at the same time, and that's the only one that we know of in Britain. And in particular, the temple next to the Forum, which you can visit and still see, was built in this period, as was the town wall is, I think, late 3rd, early 4th, and the bastions are mid 4th, and they give a very impressive look to the town. It's clearly a major settlement and of some importance, and that's typical of the sorts of works that were going on in the major towns of Britannia Prima, and hint at the wealth of the place. We can see some of this in Wroxeter's history. This is the work that I've been doing recently on the new dating of the sequence of excavations on the Baths Basilica. This is, I'm literally writing this up now for Britannia, and this is a first presentation of the current sequence. So this is the situation that's now been arrived at through radiocarbon dating. And this plan shows you the basilica as it looked like in the later 3rd into the mid 4th century AD, when it was still largely in use, but it was beginning to show real problems. The portico, North Portico, for example, where the boardwalk is, was beginning to subside because of structures underneath in the legionary fortress that were collapsing and creating problems in the overlying structures, much as had happened at Caerwent. The portico and the west portico, where buildings 63 and 64 are situated, had been dismantled too, and that's why the buildings are there. The period immediately after that, period 350 to 375 is really the demise of the basilica. We have further structures erected inside the building. The floors are in a very poor condition, and around about 375 they take the roof off. They are also breaking through the precinct wall to build other structures around the baths, and these may be to do with maintenance of the baths themselves. The baths themselves seem to have remained in use, although as you'll see on the right slide, at the top is the original plan, and underneath is the later 4th century operation of the baths, where the main bath suite had been abandoned and stripped out, been robbed, to create these other side suites. So the area of the baths themselves had become much smaller, which probably made them easier to heat. So they were still in use. They were being maintained from the basilica. The basilica itself seems largely to have gone out of use and was not abandoned, as we'll see, but eventually the roof was taken down. The sort of story of relative civic decline is not mirrored in the countryside, where we see some really quite significant structures erected in this in the 4th century, particularly the great villas. Woodchester, one of the largest mosaic pavements recorded in Britain. Obviously, Llantwit Major down in South Wales, Chedworth, and the reconstruction is of Great Whitcomb, another of these fantastic villas. There are many, many around Cirencester and Gloucester, and that's not an accident. That's to do with the administration, which was based in Cirencester. Cirencester was the capital of the province, so naturally the wealthy gravitated there to exert their influence, and that's why there are so many villas around Cirencester and Gloucester, because you had to be there to influence the governor of the province, who rarely will have left Cirencester. Beyond that, though, in those other areas, those sort of areas that weren't Romanized, there's very little evidence of Romanness at all. We see it tentatively in places like Dinllichwy, which although they have roundhouses as bottom right there, they also have rectangular buildings, which are very unnative looking, if you like. Even Cefn Grigainog on the Grigainog Ridge, the Grigainog Peninsula, the Llyn Peninsula, has rectangular buildings too. So we know that that people continue to live their lives as they had through the Iron Age. There's very little sign of the Roman world impinging on these people, and that was an important factor, as we'll see later on. As far as the Roman army goes, there was still a Roman presence in the province, certainly throughout the 4th century. The legionary base was at Chester. The other legionary base, which had been present in earlier times, Caerleon, seems to have been much diminished after the early third century. And the garrison, certainly by the end of the Roman period, seems to be in Richborough in Kent, not in Caerleon. There is evidence for some activity within Caerleon, as noted in the recent report by Peter Guest and Andrew Gardner, but that is not. There's no evidence that's military at all. It's just there are houses. There's a post-Roman house, but there's not much more we can say about it, and it certainly doesn't seem to be related to a military presence in that sense. So Chester is certainly the focus of the late military activity in the Roman in this province, and you can see from the map that essentially the military presence is heavily linked with the coast. Caerhun now, I think, is now attested in this late period, and there are further watchtowers that have been identified along that North Welsh coast, which is what you'd expect leading up to Chester, and keeping an eye on the hostile Irish Sea, from which raids from the Irish would materialise at times. The Bristol Channel is the other obvious vulnerability, and clearly the fort at Cardiff, the new Saxon shore style fort, heavily fortified base there, balanced by is almost certainly the defence of the Bristol Channel, in the same way that the one at Carnarvon does the same job there. So it's a defence focused on the coast. As I've said, the frontier is the coast at this period. There is no presence at all along what we think of as the Welsh March. We have the towns, but that's it. And there's no military presence there at all. All of this begins to really change quite radically at the very end of the 4th century. And specifically, the Battle of Adrianople of 378 was an absolute catastrophe for the Roman world, in that one of the emperors loses his life in battle, and most of the Eastern army is destroyed. It has to be rebuilt, mostly by taking troops from the west. The death of the emperor led to the appointment of Theodosius as co-emperor with Gratian and the young Valentinian II. And eventually Theodosius took, basically, as the older dynasty died out, as Valentinian and Gratian died, he established the House of Theodosius himself, and then his sons and other relatives. The sort of loss of a major part of the military led to increasingly the army being supplemented by mercenaries, by troops purchased from outside the empire, brought in as a short-term measure to boost the army, to enable it to function. And some of the commanders of these men rose to quite high positions, the most famous of which is Stilicho, the Vandal general. And this trend becomes much more significant after the death of Theodosius I himself in 395. Following his death, there is a sort of power struggle, because his sons, Arcadius and Honorius, are very young. They effectively have their mother as a regent, and various generals put themselves forward as emperor. Not least the usurpers Magnus Maximus from Britain, known to the Welsh as Maxim Bledig, and Constantine III, who is the one of 3 or 4, if I remember, rebels within the years 406 to 7. So there's there is a very profound military crisis going on in this early 5th century period. But there's also a profound social change going on at the same time, in that the Edict of Milan was issued in 382, which formally recognises Christianity as the official religion of the empire. It doesn't outlaw paganism. That happens 10 years later with the Theodosian decrees, which ended pagan religion as a formal practice within the empire and allowed the closure and demolition of temples. Disadvantaged him clearly, and anyone who was working in the imperial service and had, this had been the law since Constantine. Anyone within the imperial service, which meant the army and the civil service, had to be Christian. So there's some really quite profound military and social change going on within the empire, and it does have an impact. We can see archaeologically. I'm now beginning to think, or strongly suspect, that the reorganization that Wroxeter, which we've redated through radiocarbon. What we're now finding is that the large building, which we had posited in the centre of the basilica, it's shrunk a bit. It's being contained now within the walls of the basilica, but it's nonetheless still the same building largely. It doesn't extend across the wall, the north wall, although it does have a back door, as you can see. But this building is constructed within the ruins of the basilica, within the shell of the basilica. The north colonnade had to be demolished. The columns of the north colonnade are taken out, but those of the south colonnade might well have stayed in situ. There are that phase is then added to. They build buildings along the south wall. There's a burial west of building 10, between the purple areas and the orange platform there. We now know that that's contemporary with this building. And then the northwest corner of the basilica collapses into that substance I mentioned earlier, and that whole corner is rebuilt with a long building, and also a wooden barrier is erected to bridge the gap. So in effect, this space, this basilica, is being controlled. The access to it is controlled. It is a controlled precinct, if you like. Can't just wander in. There are certain specific entrances through which you have to go in, and the access is controlled. And this, I think, ties in with what's happening in the bars. The bars themselves have gone out of use, and two of the rooms seem to have been reused. Specifically, the unheated room of the bars seems to, and its associated water features seem to have been reused as a chapel, and the evidence for that is the number of burials around it. These burials must have obviously happened after the period when burial was not allowed within the city under Roman law, and this law changes with the Christianization of the empire, obviously, because where you had churches, you wanted people wanted to be buried in and around them, and if they're in a town, that meant obviously Roman law had to change. We have no formal plans of these burials, but these are the ones mentioned by Thomas Wright in his excavations, rather his clearance of the baths in 1859. And it's worth making the point, this might all sound very fanciful, but we know under the Edict of Milan that all places like Wroxeter, Civitas capitals, had to have a bishop. There was no choice about this. You had to have a bishop. You had to provide for a bishop. And the bishop took on a role within society of protecting his flock, of looking after his congregation, whatever. And those clerics would have been taken from the aristocracy, the town's aristocracy. So there were real benefits to that, to them, in that they were no longer eligible to pay tax, for example. So it was an attractive proposition to become a bishop. And that was one of the reasons why it was so readily adopted. So there are various reasons that one can think of why this might happen. I'm not just inventing this. We do have evidence for late Roman bishop in the area. Specifically, we have in the centre there, we have 2 lead tanks that were discovered at Shavington, which is near Nantwich, one of these salt springs. And on the side, there are inscriptions. These are being cast into the pan. So they were cast in when the pan was actually made. And they record 2 people. One is Cunitus, a cleric, who's said to be a cleric. And then there's another pan which records Viventus and Flagus. Viventus is on a third pan. And his title is given, we only have the second half of the word copy, but it must be episcopi, there's no other abbreviation possible. So, or restoration possible. So these pans would clearly, what is the commodity that's being produced in the salt has a value. It has in effect a salt tax, or a salt. The production of these pans would obviously intended for the use of the church, for their own use or to sell on to others and as a revenue stream. So we don't know where Flavius Faventius was based. He's not otherwise known to history. Same for Canitus. But since we're in Canobian territory, it's logical to think they will have been in the Civitas capital, which is Wroxeter. And it's very telling, I believe, that the large building that I mentioned in the basilica, the doorway of that is orientated towards the south doorway in the south wall of the basilica. And I think that is a deliberate effort to give it grandeur, to give that building grandeur, added grandeur. And as I said, the access points are controlled. So that's the evidence as far as I can take it. We'll see whether we can think of other alternatives for that, but that is my current interpretation. So we then, not long after that, move into the 5th century crisis. That was provoked famously by the Germanic tribes who crossed the frozen Rhine around about Christmas 406, and they invaded Gaul and were settled in large numbers, mostly under Roman control, but increasingly not. And then 4 years later, of course, the Goths under Alaric sacked Rome, entered and sacked Rome. And we believe there are various interpretations of this, but there is said to be a letter from the Emperor Honorius saying that Britain should look to its own defences. And it's assumed by this stage, in the first decade of the 4th century or the 5th century, that the Roman troops were removed from Britain because they just we don't have the coinage that would be associated with the body of Roman troops in Britain or a civil service. And we assume that the usurpers that I mentioned will have taken troops abroad. We can prove it in some cases through the appearance of clipped coinage on the continent. Traditionally, the English arrive slightly later in the 445. That's the Romans saying goodbye, and the English arriving. And they are said to have been invited here by someone called Vortigern in the mid 5th century. This is taken from Bede, but other sources, other later sources, it's worth emphasising they're all later sources, so we don't know how reliable they are. But that is the traditional history, if you like. And that brings us to this gap, in effect. Okay, so the Romans officially leave, shall we say, in the first decade of the 5th century, and then the English arrive in the middle of the 5th. But what about the 40 years in between? Well, I think what happens is that the provinces, all 4 of them, get together and decide to do exactly what Honorius has told them, which is to look to their own defence. And the only way to do that is to recruit troops from abroad in the same way that the Romans had been doing throughout the later 4th century. And if you look at a map, it's pretty obvious that the peoples of Anglo-Saxon England, as it became, are drawn from those, the sort of core settlements of the various peoples that are mentioned. The Saxons, for example, the Angles, are clearly geographically differentiated, and so basically they seem to relate largely to the provinces, the original provinces of Rome and Britain. And if that is the case, then the Western province, Britannia Prima, won't have been able to recruit continental barbarians because there weren't any. They're on the wrong side of Britain, if you like. So the only place they can recruit is the Irish, is in Ireland. And so that is what seems to have happened. There's plenty of evidence for Irish settlement in Western Wales, in particular, as the maps make clear, but also, as you notice, on the Cornish Peninsula, and to a degree, even as far north as Anglesey. So that, I think, explains this pattern, is that we have a 40-year period where the provinces try to maintain themselves as Roman entities in Roman fashion, and wait for Rome to come back and reclaim them. But Rome doesn't. So after 40 years, people say, well, clearly they're not coming back, and we have another situation developing. Now, obviously, it's very difficult to prove this archaeologically. We have one or two straws to clutch at, if you like. One is that we have evidence for late Roman military presence in some of the towns. Roxton has produced more Lombardi lead-weighted weapons, and they're anti-personnel weapons, which are mentioned by one of the late Roman military historians, Vegetius. And these are specifically a late Roman weapon, and more have been found at Roxton than virtually any other site in the Western Empire, apparently. I still find this extraordinary, but they're also known in Caerwent, as you can see, and from Four Crosses on the Welsh palace border, we have a burial mound which contains late Roman, early medieval spearheads. And from Gloucester, we have a burial, formal burial, coffined within a cemetery of someone who appears to be wearing military equipment, some of which relates to the buckles, in particular relate to the empire, the Central European part of the empire, Pannonia, that sort of area, Hungary, the Danube lands. And finally, we have Cinorix, the tombstone of Cinorix that was found at Wroxeter. His formula dates him to around about 500 AD, but we don't otherwise know who he is. Yeah. So basically what I think is going on is that the governor, whoever is running Britannia Prima, decides to focus the defence of Britain not on the coast anymore, because the Irish are allies, but instead along this provincial boundary, which is increasingly becoming hostile as the English assert control. It becomes more and more hostile. We've seen that some of the towns are fortified, and we have evidence, that they could have used this. How defensible they would have been is another matter. Places like Roxton, the circuit is 3 miles long. You'd need an awful lot of troops to protect a territory that big. And we just don't know whether how feasible this was. But the dots mark the defended towns of the province, and you can see that they could form some kind of barrier, but it's going to be a very porous one. So the longer this situation went on of not being able to renew Roman power, the more vulnerable things became, and the more people questioned whether they needed to be Roman, whether they needed an empire at all, and whether they could just rule themselves. Quite how these mercenaries were paid for is not clear, but one piece of evidence that we can bring to it is the Wen hoard, because that was a half a kilo of scrap silver found in 2018 at a metal detector rally by three guys. It's now been published, and when the initial date was thought to be around 450. We now think it's 500. It includes Pictish elements, it includes Anglo-Saxon elements, very small elements within it numerically, but nonetheless, they are there, and they hint at this later date. And there are various other arguments that have been put forward to suggest, to corroborate that late date as well. We clearly don't know who owns the hoard, but it's very clear indeed that it is a bullion hoard. The coins that you see arrayed around the edge there, in the top left corner, you can see coins that have been halved and quartered, and that is not something you do to Roman coins if you want to hold on to your life, because that's illegal, and you could have lost your life if you'd done that sort of thing in the Roman Empire. But clearly, these coins have moved beyond being coins; they are just silver. One use of such a hoard, although it's got a lot of money, half a kilo of silver is not a lot. If you think the Traprain law hoard was 23 kilos of silver, that gives you an idea of what a real hoard looks like. But clearly, this could have been used to pay a mercenary. We don't know, but there are other possibilities. But this is one possibility. Okay, there is some evidence of this continuing wish to be Roman, in that the mosaic floor at Chedworth, recently uncovered by the National Trust, has been layers underneath it have been dated to the mid 5th century, and that suggests that there were still people rich enough to commission mosaics and to use villas. But I think that's a sort of the final gasp, if you like. And it's very clear that the power was shifting from the elites in the cities to other areas, and specifically to the areas of the elites on the periphery of the province. Now, the one of the elements of this later shift, if you like, from brought about by the changes in the provinces from British control to contested control between British and English, is that Christians felt increasingly uncomfortable living in the east of the country, because they were under pagan rule, and if they wanted to continue to worship Christian beliefs, they had to move to the west. There is some evidence that there was some survival of it in the east, but the bulk of the evidence, as you can see from the map, shifts across into Wales, and that reinforces the position of Christianity within Britannia Prima, particularly, and then in the later successor kingdoms. And it becomes an element of the identity, the differing identities between these peoples. And it's specifically in the 5th and 6th centuries that we see the real growth of Christianity. And as I say, that's partly to do with saying they're different from the pagan English, but it's partly also because of the connections, the Mediterranean connections that came through from the Bay of Biscay or round Spain more perilously to Britain on an intermittent basis. And they're bringing not just olive oil, wine, and all the other commodities that you need in the Christian world. They're also bringing ideas, and one of those ideas, of course, is monasticism, and that finds a particularly fertile bed in both Ireland and Britain, Western Britain. And from there, it goes. You then get it spreading back across Britain into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as they Christianized later on. So we do see these Western links becoming very powerful, very important in this 5th, 6th century period, and it's reflected archaeologically in this evidence for both monasticism, but also the artifacts that are brought in from the Mediterranean world, and these appear in some of the sites. In particular, where we're not finding them, famously, is in places like Wroxeter. Although the problem with Wroxeter and places like Wroxeter is that there is just so much pottery that spotting one sherd of amphora among the many thousands and thousands of sherds might be problematic. But leaving that aside, there is no clear evidence at all of of these imports, reaching as far as places like Roxtor or Cirencester. What we do have evidence for is that they are arriving in places like Tintagel on the coast, or Dinas Powys near Cardiff, where there are these are coastal sites, and the elites who lived in these places are able to control this trade. And so in effect, you're getting a reversal, where in the former Britannia Prima, all the wealth is generated on the eastern side. Now it's being generated on the western side, and the east is being starved of resources. So it's complete flipping over. And of course, as we've seen, the western side of Britannia Prima was never very Romanized. It had just the Iron Age elites, the peoples had not really changed culturally since the Iron Age. But now they are Christianized. Now they are increasingly engaged with the Roman world, but through Christianity, not through the Roman Empire as such. And these connections are reflected in the tombstones we see, the 5th and 6th centuries, which survive in small numbers, but there's enough there to show a connection to the Roman past, the memories of the Roman past, and the wish to be associated with that Roman past. So titles like Protectorus or Magistrati or Presbyter are reflected on these monuments, are given on these monuments to demonstrate their Romanness or their Roman identity. And the same things are reflected in the Welsh dynasties. They trace their lineages from people like Maxim Bledig, who they say gave them their power, transmitted Roman power to them. And this is reflected, of course, in their legends and sagas and poems, Dream of Maxim Bledig, and the things like the Lament for Cynddylan or Canu Heledd, which to a degree reflect on the loss of the eastern parts of Britannia Prima to the English. In the Englenion, we have a site in particular that's mentioned, Pengwern, noted as the power centre for Cynddylan of Powys, and he's said to have been buried in the churches of Bassham, which is clearly Bass Church, and people have often associated Pengwern with Bass Church, but there's no evidence at all for a Dark Age settlement there or burial or anything. It's just a place name that is being cited in the poem for whatever reason. And Pengwern is often also associated incorrectly with Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury already has a perfectly good Welsh name, Amwythig, so why would it need another one? It seems very likely that Pengwern is an unknown site, and I think on various grounds, which I don't really have time to go on in enormous detail here, but basically I think Pengwern, which has been suggested by Charles Sims Williams as the location for Pengwern, I think this is a convincing identification, not least because looking out from New Pieces as I am in this photograph, looking towards the Wrekin, this is exactly the description you get in the Canu Heledd of the White Town burning. You would have seen it from here. If there had been a sack of Roxtor, which I don't think there was, but poetically, let's say there was, you would have seen it from here. So I think rather than Heledd standing on the Wrekin, she was standing here when that poem was being created. And certainly we have scientific dates to match that and artifactual evidence that bears that out. So that is how the frontier emerges, basically, that what we have is the collapse of Roman authority over time. It's not immediate. It takes about 50 years, 2 generations roughly, before people accept that Rome aren't coming back. And certainly after 476, people will have realised that there was no Roman Empire to come back, in the West anyway. And so basically what one gets is this remnant of a province, um, uh, where the rest of the province is largely dominated by the English. We have an active frontier or active zone of contention between the two along what's now the Welsh border. And the Welsh people fragments, the province fragments into power bases, independent power bases, all quite small. And that, of course, is a weakness. These are not a re-emergence of Iron Age tribal identities. They're just located in the same places because of the geography of Wales. But they are certainly independent identities, as is very clear. And these kingdoms form alliances among themselves or against themselves and against the English and with the English, and it becomes very difficult to maintain things. And the English continue to pressure against these peoples from the east. In the northeastern Wales, we get the small kingdom of Powys squeezed between the great kingdom of Gwynedd and the Mercians, both of which are growing throughout this 7th, 8th century, and they're squeezing Powys between them. And the monument of the Pillar of Eliseg is a statement of Powys against both powers, and saying, exerting a presence, if you like, in the landscape. Okay, that by the beginning of the 9th century, the province of Britannia Prima is effectively gone. It's fragmented into many different entities, and English expansion had basically severed the connection between Wales and Cornwall, or the Cornish Peninsula. But it still took a long time for them to actually be conquered, and the last element was only finally conquered in the early 13th century by Edward I. So it had a very long life in many senses. Looking at it on the other side of the border, briefly, we have the emergence of the counties of England, and I've taken here Shropshire. Here is the evidence plotted from the Portable Antiquities scheme and other evidence for the English presence, if you like, in Shropshire. And what we think now is happening in Shropshire is a fusion between the existing British population and a relatively small English population, which forms an Anglo-British kingdom, the Mercians. And they Christianised after the death of Penda in 685. So on the left-hand side, you've got the early map showing very little Anglo-Saxon evidence. There's people coming in the south of the county, the burial sites there, and there's various other bits of cultural material appearing on the eastern side, penetrating as far as Condover. And then in the middle map, you've got, in effect, the Mercian kingdom emerging under people like Offa and his predecessors and descendants. And you can see that is very much weighted towards the lowland areas where we're finding the evidence for them. And of course, we've got Offa's Dyke. And then on the final map, the third map, you've got, in effect, the emergence of Shropshire as a county. You can see the outline of the county within the Fines. And that's reflecting the influence of Danelaw, of the conflict with the Viking period, and the frontier, the Mercian frontier that ran diagonally across the county from northwest to southeast, roughly. I simplify a lot, but you can see from the maps how the character of the what became the county of Shropshire changed over this period. So the last point is, of course, the expression of this boundary, this growing boundary, this division, linguistic, cultural, initially a religious boundary too, between the Welsh and English, formulated in Offa's Dyke, and that initially, as I say, it's posed as a struggle between Christianity and non-Christians, but also Romans and non-Romans. The English too, once they had converted to Christianity, assumed a Roman identity and saw themselves as the successors of the Roman people. And that is another source of conflict. But eventually there's a rapprochement expressed as the Dyke. And, while many see that as a sort of an English imposition on the landscape, which it was, of course, I would also characterize it perhaps as a recognition that the English were not strong enough to conquer Wales, at least at that point, and as they had reached a stalemate. Don't forget the English gave up land on the other side of Offa's Dyke to respect that boundary. So there is clearly an acknowledgement that the Welsh had successfully created their own identity and their status as a peoples, post-Roman peoples, was recognised. Thank you.